Thank you so much, Professor Hirschkind, for joining us. Um, this is really my pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Charles Hirschkind, who's chair of the Anthropology Department at University of California, Berkeley. And just a few words by way of introduction, not that he really needs much of an introduction, but Professor Hirschkind's research interests concern religious practice, media technologies, and emergent forms of political community in the Middle East, North America, and Europe. He gives particular attention to diverse configurations of the human sensorium and the histories, ethics, and politics they make possible, taking contemporary developments within the traditions of Islam as his primary focus. He explores how various religious practices and institutions have been revised and renewed both by modern norms of social and political life and by the styles of consumption and culture linked to global mass media practices. And very quickly, his first book, The Ethical Soundscape, Cassette Sermons and Islamic Counterpublics, explores how a popular Islamic media form, the cassette sermon, has profoundly transformed the political geography of the Middle East over the last 3 decades. And today we're going to be discussing his wonderful new book, which I had the title for, and I should remember it because I've read it. The Feeling of History, Islam, Romanticism, and Andalusia, if I'm not mistaken. So thank you so much, Professor Hirschkind. Really, it's a genuine honor and pleasure to have you with us on the Dark Seal Commons podcast today. If I may, right at the start, sort of convey my deepest condolences for the passing of the great professor of anthropology, Sabah Mahmood. It's been 3 years now since she passed. I just wanted to share a feeling that no doubt many people, I know without question, many people share, that is, she really profoundly touched our lives with her incredible erudition and brilliance, and really we're truly grateful to her and to you for all that she's done, all that you've done together and continue to do. God bless you.
Thank you for saying that, Hasan.
No, of course. If it's not, if you'll forgive the sort of shift from having just shared my condolences, but I think it relates, and if you'll forgive the, if it's somewhat uncouth or insensitive, but the question of feeling, of course, is central to your work, and in thinking about someone's life, for example, my intuition is that we don't think of a person's life in terms of brute facts as perhaps modern science will have us, or even scientific history rather, or historiography will have it. And I wonder if you sort of resonate with that notion, and then of course I'd like to bring it to the sort of central, some of the central questions in your work.
Yeah, not only do we not think of it in terms of brute facts, but its reality in our lives is not at all reducible to what you're calling brute facts, right? And certainly that's been a reflection that both, plays an important role in this book as well in other writings I've done, I think. I mean, in some sense, this book is about a movement which mourns a great loss, which starts by a recognition that there's been an immense loss that took place with the expulsion of Muslims and Jews from from Iberia in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and that starts and cultivates that feeling of loss as the basis to sort of come to recognize an inheritance that has been erased and has been denied, and that people understand is integral to their lives, even if it's difficult to sort of to connect with it. But to be able to connect with it requires a passional act. It requires an act of feeling, by which one comes to feeling fully encounter those dimensions of the past. And I think that resonates with what you're saying about personal relationships as well, that they're not about simply what one did, but about the way in which we register in each other's emotional lives. And that's central to the argument, I think, in this book.
Well, thank you so much for that. It's a really no exaggeration on my part to say that it's a remarkable work, which is not easy reading, but that does not equate to that's really because the subject matter is very profound, and of course it's, I mean, you write beautifully and fluidly. My issue is I have ADD, so reading even simple things is hard enough, but that's a personal issue. Could you speak kindly a little bit to, and forgive me if I'm sort of mispronouncing some of these words and names even. Could you speak a little bit to, or what does who are the Andalusistas? What does Andalusismo mean? Just as far as laying the groundwork, please.
Sure. So Andalusismo, in its sort of common everyday usage in Spain, is often used to refer to a kind of regional nationalist movement in southern Spain that has its origins in the early part of the 20th century. But there's also a broader sense of Andalusismo that is the one that's central to my book, and that is, as I interpret it, it's a tradition of critical reflections on the norms of Spanish and European politics and culture. One, though, that's based on a cultivated appreciation, a feeling for the histories and legacies of Southern Iberia's Muslim and Jewish societies. So, a key the sort of principle at the heart of this tradition, as I describe it, the tradition of Andalusismo, is the idea that, contemporary Andalusia, and by extension, Spain and Europe as a whole, are linked in important ways with medieval Al-Andalus, even though this link has been, let's say, historically denied and effaced. And that the sort of challenges faced by Andalusians today and by Europeans requires a recognition of that effaced historical tie. That there's been a cost paid by, in some sense, erasing that very long period of history, almost 800 years.
Mm.
And that in order for, and this is sort of a movement started by Spanish intellectuals and journalists and artists in the late 19th century, who felt that Spain, in facing the crises that it was facing at that time, which is the moment when it was losing its colonial possessions and entering a period of decline relative to the other countries in Europe and so on, that it would be only by embracing a history that it had steadfastly sort of denied, that it would be able to sort of confront the challenges of modernity. So that the tradition I look at is that tradition that has its origin in the late 19th century and that insists on the necessity of recuperating an appreciation of that past and incorporating it into the lives of contemporary people. So Andalusistas are those who pursue that particular, who take it on themselves, the task of accommodating their lives to this inheritance, which they seek to reveal and seek to explore and discover and study and recreate in some aspects and to integrate it into sort of the contemporary world. Um, you asked me something else about yeah. I mean, those are the key terms at the heart of this book.
Yes.
I mean, I should say this book is not. It's not about a claim that actually Spain is, like, I'm not writing as a historian saying that, well, actually Spain has been importantly constituted by this earlier history, which would be, let's say, an academic argument.
Sure.
What I'm looking at is a group of people who've tried to live in the light of that claim, who've tried to accommodate it, to make it a part of their lives, not just as a historical claim, but as a way of life.
Yes.
And that, I think, is, a key what drew me to this movement was that, right, it
Yes.
was not just simply an abstract claim, but an attempt to live in a particular way.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. So what are some of the uh, sort of academic, traditionally academic, what are some of the challenges that traditional historians make vis-a-vis Andalusistas? One of them is, if I'm not mistaken, they sort of compare it to Romanticism and, you know, people being overly sort of romanticizing, but Romanticism is in the sort of broader philosophical sense. That's something that comes to mind. Could you speak a little bit to that, please?
Yes, I mean, this movement, on one hand, is regularly described as romantic, and in some sense, that's not wrong.
Right.
That is, the movement is certainly was, importantly influenced by the Romantic movement, and particularly the critique of, Enlightenment rationalism and scientism as too impoverished a vision of human life. Uh, the Andalusistas share that critique. They also share an emphasis on the importance of sensory experience and knowledge um, to life, right? So there's quite an emphasis on the, let's say, the importance of the passions within historical ways of knowing. Um, and that also comes with an appreciation of musical traditions and art and so on. So in that sense, this movement is an inheritor of aspects of Romanticism. When people make the claim that this is a romantic movement, though, they mean to dismiss it that way. They mean to sort of identify it as a recognizable form of error that we know is actually not only a deviation from actual history, but a dangerous deviation, right? Because Romanticism comes to be associated with a kind of nationalism and particularly its more extreme forms, and in Spain that means fascism and Franco period. So for mainstream historians, Andalusismo, it it awakens certain sort of fears of a dangerous romanticism, one that there's in within recent historical experience, right, is they're very aware of the whole Franco period as also grounded, let's say, in a kind of romantic nationalism. The difference is, of course, in the national Catholicism of the Franco period insisted on Spain's abiding Catholic identity as central to what it meant to be Spanish. Where for the Andalusistas, there's not that, right. It's not about an abiding Catholic identity. It's really more about recognizing that one is the inheritor of a heterogeneous and complex patterns of cultural and civilizational forms. And so Andalusismo is an attempt to live in the light of and adjust one's life to the fact of that complex inheritance, which in that sense, it is not, I don't see it as a form of nationalism. And in many ways, it is many of the Andalusistas are sharply critical of, and were sharply critical of, the nationalism of the Franco years and of the attempts to sort of describe Andalusismo as simply a variety of nationalism. I mean, for the Andalusistas, the very sort of historical geography that an Andalusista vision opens up is one that stands in contrast to the sort of world of nations, cultures, languages, right? Because it emphasizes all kinds of bridges, particularly between the Middle East, between India as well, and Latin America, and um, so it's, for historians, I mean, to come back to your first question, they see it as a romantic falsification of the past in the service of ideology, a dangerous ideology, an ideology that, let's say, in the Franco years served colonialist ends, and that today serves a kind of liberal multiculturalism, but that in either case is dangerous because it involves the falsification of the past, in their view. And my view is that this is not about falsification of the past. It's rather the way in which the Andalusistas find themselves powerfully drawn to certain aspects of the past, which they see as having great relevance in the present. And in that sense, to emphasize and to celebrate and to be sort of passionately pulled by certain aspects of the past is not a falsification or an idealization, right? But it actually, for the Andalusistas, it responds to a very felt sense of the significance of that past today. And I think that has to be recognized as one of the that our relation to the past cannot just be grasped through a kind of dispassionate exercise of reason, but we find ourselves implicated in the past. We find the past inhabiting us in ways that, um, that may disturb us, that may draw us passionately, that may, um, that may affect us emotionally in all sorts of ways. And for the Andalusistas, this requires that we come to have a better understanding of that past that impacts on us so powerfully, so as to understand why it resonates so strongly in our lives today. Um, I think that's. I think that's.
No, that's great. Thank you so much. Could you say a little bit about? I won't remember the exact phrasing that you used, but early on, I think it was in the introduction, you mentioned how the sort of modern modern historiography, and forgive me, please correct me if I get this wrong in terms of its basic brushstrokes. Modern historiography goes into shaping neoliberalism and sort of that sort of political aspect. And in another place you mentioned, and again, please correct me any mistakes that I make. You have a very interesting turn of phrase, the philosophical theological the theological political, is it the political theological nature of modern historiography. Could you say a little bit about those, and also relatedly, you mentioned Foucault's notion of counter history, how that the sort of this new accounting of the past, which wasn't just a celebration of the sovereigns that ruled by divine edict or what have you. This historical narrative emerged, and how does modern historiography? In some ways, my intuition is, my sense is that you're showing how you're indicating also how modern historiography, while claiming in many ways to be speaking against the sort of forces and the powers and so forth, is in some ways re-entrenching itself in a type of narrative which goes against the everyday person. This is totally my language, but
Okay, that's a lot of questions. Let me
sorry.
start with one about the discipline of history,
Yes.
and so there's a lot of very interesting work that explores the really the 19th century emergence of the discipline of history, and its role and its place within a certain kind of liberal society. I'd say liberal, not neoliberal in the contemporary sense.
Ah, yes.
And that is that the discipline of history, it helps secure a particular relation to the past, one that accords with a particular view of human life, that is a view that is that has emerged with the growth of modern states. So according to sort of the protocols of modern historiography, the past, when properly understood, is in the past, right? And one must anachronism must be rejected in principle, right? And so everything must be put in its place. And in that one effect of that, right, as opposed, let's say, to notions like tradition or providence, which presuppose certain kinds of ways in which the past continues to inhabit the present, right? So, like within traditions, what you're doing now, like as a part of a traditional practice, is inseparable from ways in which it was done in the past, right? And but the notion of time and of history that undergirds, say, the modern discipline of history, right, is one that secures the pastness of the past, and in that sense ensures that there are no restrictions on our agency to act in the present. So in that sense, it secures the conditions of freedom from the past,
Mm.
in principle, that are, let's say, part of a kind of, liberal understanding of our own autonomous agency to make the world we live in,
Mm. Mm.
right? And that sort of almost Promethean idea of our ability to shape the present, which is a dimension of liberalism. Um, the notion of historiography undergirds that by securing our immunity from that past in some ways. So that's one, that's one dimension of it. And a key part of that is the insistence that the past must be approached dispassionately,
Mm.
right? The passions must not be allowed to sort of shape the historian's perspective, because that always leads to a distortion. And that's thought that sort of the neutrality of that position is understood to undergird its objectivity. But it's not really neutral. It's a particular, to talk about dispassion is to talk about a particular arrangement of the passions, right? A particular sort of configuration of them that's understood to be appropriate to disclosing aspects of the past. And like any other approach to history, it discloses particular ones, and it discloses them in accord with certain particular kinds of assumptions, ones that are compatible, let's say, with the imperatives of a modern political order. Um, and that's why, in my book, I try to suggest that there's nothing wrong with the discipline of history in that sense at all. It's has been immensely important in all sorts of ways, but it cannot monopolize. It's not the only way that we find ourselves bound to the past. That is, our relation to the past, it cannot simply be disclosed only through this one method of a kind of dispassionate exercise of reason, because the past is part of our lives in other ways as well, that only distorts if we assume it must be grasped through that particular lens. You asked about the theological political, and
Yes.
I think the reason why I'm in the sort of the historiography of Spain, and let's say as it develops in the 19th century, then there's a kind of what's called Reconquista ideology. Let's say there's the idea that really modern Spain emerges through the act of expelling the foreign intrusion of Muslims and Jews, and Spain really comes into itself, its moment of birth as a nation, right, is through that act of eliminating this foreign element in some ways. And so in that sense, there's a theological political foundation of the nation. And so it is both a religious act and a political one, because it is a religious act that secures the purity of the Catholic nation. And that is also, I'm speaking about that in relation to Spain, but one can also think of that more broadly in relation to Europe, and how the very sort of emergence of Europe, right, also has to do with both a certain sort of relationship of antagonism with Islam, which is, let's say prior to the emergence of the concept of Europe, let's say, still under the concept of Christendom, but that space is emerging through a kind of definition based on a contrast and an aggressive rejection of what's seen to be a dangerous Muslim other. And in that sense, when you hear today politicians in Europe who say, well, Muslim values are incompatible with the Christian or Judeo-Christian foundations of Europe, there one recognizes also a kind of theological political operation, where that the very sort of the religious constitution of the of the continent is invoked to define its appropriate borders and what fits and what does not fit within it. a counter history. I mean, I had, Foucault writes um, about a sort of a shift in the 16th century where prior to that time the sort of discourses of history served the purpose of celebrating the glory of the ruler, and therefore served to, to legitimate the sovereign. And in the 16th century, Foucault notes there's a new kind of historical discourse that emerges that he calls something like mythico-religious, um, that that instead of simply glorifying the sovereign, it takes the side of the defeated, and it takes the side of those who've been silenced by sovereign power, and seeks to uncover a voice that has been repressed through the exercise of sovereign power. And so, in that sense, it's a kind of counter history from the standpoint of sovereign power at the time. And Andalusismo, it very much inherits and draws sort of sustenance from that historical form of the idea of a history that has been denied and effaced and must be uncovered. And because it's been hidden, it's particularly difficult to uncover. So you have to sort of attune yourself to to be able to recognize it in your language, in your gestures, in your forms of sociability, your art, your music. And Andalusismo seeks to cultivate that capacity of recognition. Um, as you mentioned, and Foucault in his discussion of this mentions that this very what emerges initially as a kind of counter history, then it becomes appropriated by very forms of centralizing power, who now claim that the history of the nation is the history of the nation as it struggles against threats to the purity of its race, right? Threats from dangerous others. And so it's also cast as a kind of an embattled collective who's struggling to define itself and the conditions of existence against the threats of what are seen to be often racially defined others. And so that's that whole the kind of it's the earlier way in which it was understood as a challenge to sovereign power. It now becomes a mechanism within the operations of sovereign power, is what Foucault argued.
And one sees this all the time in more recent cultural history. I know it's been mentioned how rap music, when originally it was a very sort of serious form of expression, protesting the conditions, in particular for African Americans, that very musical form was then, of course, subsequently co-opted by the corporate music industry, and then it completely, I mean, not completely, I mean, there's still some very powerful voices in that sort of in hip hop, but so much of it is actually the way. I mean, I've heard it put like this by very serious consumers of hip hop and rap music, that the messaging that now occurs through that medium that was originally a form of protest actually seeks to undermine the African American communities, which is very interesting and very scary.
That is scary, yeah. And I hadn't thought of that parallel, but you're right. I mean, this is something, of course, musicians often, musicians as they're starting are often worried about what will be the effects of the commercialization of their music and so on. And this is from the standpoint of, let's say, individual musicians. But absolutely, if one looks at musical forms that have been simply turned into, embraced by and become essential parts of consumer culture in ways that really undoes the kind of critical thrust that initially made them so interesting and so attractive. It's a sad and repeated story.
Right, and this, I mean, related to everything you've said, and sort of to echo what you've said, this sort of strikes me as one of the almost inevitable problems of institutions and institutionalization. And I wanted to sort of ask you a question. relating to some things that you've already sort of mentioned about the, and this is a phrase that you also use in the book, about the excavation of a buried past, and how it relates to, as far as Andalusia is concerned, more specifically in the context of your book, but not only Andalusia. The idea of living by denying the reality of one's existence. Could you speak a little bit to that? The reality being the Jewish and Muslim history of Andalusia, of Spain, how that's very actively, concertedly been erased, not accidentally, very forcefully. And what does that imply as far as Spain's self-identity? I mean, I don't want to put, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if you could speak a little bit to that, please.
I mean, that term is one, that, as you know, is a term that was coined by Americo Castro, who was, a mid-20th century literary historian, Spanish literary historian, who spent much of his career in the United States because he was forced to flee during the Franco period. But he had a vision of that. He was primarily a scholar of literary text, but he sort of had a vision of Spanish society as having been fashioned by the interrelations between Muslims and Christians and Jews, which gave a distinct shape to, which resulted in a distinct form of life. And he saw that, the modern Spanish political order had been built on a rejection and denial of those very entwinements and interdependencies and forms of cohabitation and accommodation. And so the very, what he saw as the kind of reactionary rejection of that very key sort of moment in the formation of certain sort of deeper aspects of Spanishness, you might say, right, led to a kind of what he described as like living while denying the reality of one's existence, living in some sense off kilter or out of or disconnected from a sort of foundational aspect of who one is. There's a kind of one could think of that in a variety of terms, but he wanted to suggest that very sort of that rejection of an aspect of oneself resulted in a kind of, he saw it as resulting in a kind of provincialism, a kind of narrow-mindedness, sort of xenophobia and racism that he associated with the Franco period. And I think for many Andalusistas today, they also see that the kind of xenophobia that one sees in Spain as in other parts of Europe, and particularly towards Muslim immigrants, draws sustenance from a very from this history of a kind of auto-rejection, of self-rejection, that is a very, you could describe it as a very particular kind of psychological predicament, and but one that he felt had very deleterious consequences on for the Spanish. And so, I mean, the task for the Andalusistas, you asked about the excavation of a buried past. The task for Andalusismo is to seek to recover those very forms of interrelation, forms of life that one finds embodied in traditions of music, in art, in other cultural forms, in the landscape that one inhabits, in the language one speaks. The way all of those things are in some ways saturated by aspects of that past, even though they've become unrecognizable in the present because of contemporary Europeans have been attuned to not be able to recognize them. And so it requires a particular sort of learning to attune oneself to the presence of those things, of that past, and the way in which it's not just a distant past, but an inheritance that continues to be, let's say, alive in Andalusian cultural forms, um, and that has implications, also vast political and implications in terms of, let's say, one's relation to the Middle East and one's relation to Islam and Judaism, and that demands a kind of remapping of moral political geography. Um, and so much of Andalusista thought has to do with that remapping. Like, how do we how do we find ourselves situated, historically and geographically, once we start to recognize our profound entwinement with these other parts of the world that we had forcibly ejected, and that can place political demands, or at least the requirements of a certain political reflection. And that's also a dimension of Andalusismo, this kind of developing a different moral political geography of one's existence. I mean, I can give you an example of that. Just
Yes, please, yes.
one of the people I talk about, Rodolfo Gil Benumaya, is who was an early 20th century, a journalist and also a scholar uh, of Arab societies, and who um, and who became a sort of leading exponent of Andalusismo, and wrote extensively both on the sort of medieval past and how significant it was, but also he wrote on the Middle East, and he found that um, both that contemporary events taking place in the Middle East, he didn't just see them as something happening over there, but he was drawn as an Andalusian to recognize them as part of his own life, because his own life was sort of constitutively entwined with what was happening there. So even though he was working within the Franco regime, and this is a sort of fascinating story, he increasingly was in close collaboration with the leaders of Moroccan nationalism, and later on with the leaders of pan-Islamism and pan-Arabism, who he both wrote together with, whose ideas he promoted in Spain. And so he wasn't someone who simply, let's say, wrote about the glories of an ancient past. He saw that as a political mandate that required an attempt to sort of reorganize the kind of political map in ways. And one sort of striking thing, he also saw Latin America, both due to Spanish colonialism and due to the sort of prominence of Arabs within many Latin American nations. He saw Latin America as part of this larger remapping of the world, as a natural ally of, let's say, both Spain and the Middle East and parts of Central Asia. And so he spent a lot of time cultivating relationships with Arab leaders in Latin America, and seeking to build kind of political and commercial ties across this strange cartography that linked Spain to the Middle East to the New World. And what's fascinating is that when the Arab League was founded in 1945, his name was put forward to be the delegate from Latin America to the Arab League. Now, he wasn't an Arab, nor was he a Latin American, but in his actions, in his sort of political career, he had defined a space in which he could inhabit those things as both, a champion of a kind of civilizational form for which Arabic and Islam was central, and which Latin America was also integral to. And so the founders of the Arab League could recognize in him a suitable candidate to be a representative to that body from Latin America. All of which is to say, one sees therefore the way in which his vision was not just sort of at the level of an imaginary, but he sought to realize it in his very actions that were both political. He also, established commercial networks and cultural networks, and so it's that kind of practical activities that Andalusismo gave rise to that I think makes it important to think with, not just as a certain sort of argument. It
mm,
wasn't. It wasn't just an argument,
no.
it's, but something much more.
In that regard, his example um, reminds me of Muhammad Asad, who I
Yeah,
mean, you mentioned a little bit, and of course, he's the father of your friend and one-time thesis advisor, the famous Talal Asad. But
and what strikes me about both those figures, like Ben Umayya, is right routinely seen as a marginal figure, simply sort of whose thoughts were muddied by the romanticism of the time. That is, there's a kind of dismissive, and in many accounts of Muhammad Asad, he's seen as a kind of part of the sort of Jewish Orientalist, a moment of sort of Jewish Orientalist,
right,
European Jewish Orientalism, which is a way to sort of
dismiss him, yes,
dismiss him in a very serious way.
not
That
take
is,
him seriously at all. Right, yeah,
yes. So in that sense, his own clearly romantic sort of initial
yes, yeah.
encounter didn't end there. It opened up in a world in which he ended up playing a very important role in the
Right.
fashioning of contemporary Islamic movements. And
Well, you also make the point, the very important point that about the history of Romanticism, why it came about, the philosophical impetus behind it. So just to in common day, everyday parlance, we say, "Oh, you're just being a romantic." It's
yeah,
it's it's a it's like the easiest way to shut someone up, right? But the fact that romantics played a very important role.
and it's still. I mean, what strikes me is that it's not just the. I mean, most most people in the humanities and social sciences, of course, also take issue with a kind of this sort of highly rationalistic vision of human life that was pervaded by many Enlightenment thinkers, just as the Romantics did, right? Which they saw that that failure to grasp the very ways in which you know sensory life has great implications for who we are, for our relation to the past, for our relation to each other, for even for the way we think and what we value, and Enlightenment rationalism could not quite grasp those things, and so we think about the sort of scholarship that today that we find important to us, including things like we understand our views of language are not just as some sort of abstract mechanical system of reference and representation, but as language has a sensual and a historical dimensions to it that resonate very closely with romantic critiques of the kind of impoverished view of language of some Enlightenment thinkers, or think about critiques of the liberal subject that that we all in some ways that are important to much contemporary scholarship, and that subject being too impoverished a view of a subject,
Yes.
because by the very way in which it's detached both from the sort of both from the sort of traditional and sensory conditions of its formations and its embeddedness, let's say, in forms of life that have implications for the kinds of agency it can exercise, for the kind of thought that is available to it, and so on. So all of those things seem to me to draw sustenance from romantic traditions and to the romantic critique. And so it's just striking to me that we still use the term romantic as a kind of red flag pointing way of dismissing things
Right.
when so much of our contemporary theory is so indebted to it. And I think I use Wittgenstein quite a bit, and I see
Yes.
Wittgenstein as very much inheriting aspects, and certainly people like Heidegger or Ricoeur or all kinds of thinkers were powerfully sort of influenced by it.
Well, thank you for that. Uh, uh, we were talking we were talking just not too long ago about Americo Castro, and this relates to just some things you just mentioned. This sort of having a sort of a feel, and to use that very important word, for our past, how our conditions, our current conditions are inevitably shaped by some sort of historical um, sort of conditions, and his sort of rejection of scientific history in favor of a poetic or of approaching life and lived reality through poesis. I'm reminded very quickly of something that I heard Wayne Proudfoot, who taught at Columbia for many years. He's now Professor Emeritus. He mentioned once, in a seemingly sort of offhand, simple remark, but I think it holds a lot of depth to it. He said that if one really wants to study the human condition, one should read poetry. which is fascinating, and it so really resonates with me as someone. I mean, my background is in English actually originally, so literature, poetry, that's the artistic production. I just wanted to raise some questions about Europe's self-image, of course, as being objective, to use that word, highly problematic word, which has been problematized endlessly in all the sciences, the hard sciences, the soft sciences, of course, and the humanities. And yet it never goes away. We must be objective. We must be dispassionate. We must describe things as they really are. And forgive me, I have a tendency of sort of attacking a few sort of ideas and questions together, but as they're coming up very quickly, if I may pose also the something that you also raise in your book, this sort of the creation of the modern subject, the sort of Cartesian subject, almost inevitably has to, it seems, has to have this separation from his past, perhaps. And I wonder what I mean. Could you speak a little bit to those?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there, but I think I see a lot of things. Yes, it's very interesting that, of course, yes, we've even in the hard sciences, there's a one finds kind of critiques of objectivity and so on, and yet
Yes,
it's funny that the discipline of history is pretty recalcitrant to that. That is one of the areas where it seems to me that an insistence on an objectivity remains very very dear to that discipline.
but
And
I
so
wonder. So if I may interject, forgive me. I wonder if, because even in the hard sciences, I mean, when we study the hard, people who study the sciences, the hard sciences at a high level, they inevitably will say, well, the observer famously affects the system that is being observed, so there's no such thing as objective reality, etc., etc.
yeah,
So we have that understanding within amongst the as it were, the
yeah,
professional scientists, right?
right, right,
However, there's a type of mainstream discourse that
yeah.
inhabits pretty much and percolates and pervades everyday consciousness, which is to say, well, it's science, right? How many times have we heard that line used? Stick to the science. And yet scientists disagree all the time, not least with everything that's going on now, right? And their viewpoints change all the time. So I wonder, in raising this, making this interjection, I can't help wonder to what extent is this claim to objectivity very much part of the formation of Europe, European modernity's self-identity. We are objective. We what we say is true. It's not mythological. It's not religious in the old sense. And the sort of you see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying, and certainly that was right. I mean, one thinks about um, that was certainly the standpoint of Europeans as they went out into the world, and they what they discovered in other people's forms of knowledge were all varieties of error, and which stood in contrast to European knowledges, which were varieties of truth, and that still remains. It's very funny, I was just looking on Wikipedia at the other day, and I was looking at a range of things like various kinds of Asian medical traditions like acupuncture, and looking at some sort of European ones like osteopathy and um, reflexology, and even homeopathy, which of course has a long, in Europe is. Wikipedia, on each one of those entries, Wikipedia has a variety of pseudoscience. Look under quackery. In each one of those. Now that is, I don't even think that was there even a few months ago, but it's been driven in part by the politics about sort of governing truth online, particularly following the politics around the elections here in the United States, in which, what was seen is that falsehoods were spread and with dangerous consequences around the elections. But what it's meant, it's allowed that then who becomes the arbiter of what's true and false? Well, in this case, it's just the American Medical Association, which has called all of these things quackery and now insists that Wikipedia defines them as that. So there's something dangerous in this inviting the sort of arbiters of truth, because what are the institutions that have the power to arbitrate truth? And they are, often very old conservative institutions. So that's kind of a worrisome trend in this current moment where, my God, I mean, that Wikipedia can only describe acupuncture as quackery, as like
acupuncture in the UK. Actually, one can get acupuncture for back problems under the NHS, which is fascinating.
And there's even some of that here starting, but it runs counter though to sort of the the AMA's kind of model.
Well, so this, I mean, sorry, I don't mean to forgive me. No, I mean, this really, to my mind, and this is very much in keeping with what you've just said, with some problems that I've been thinking about a lot about lately, is exactly how truth is packaged and foisted on us by the digital, by these very powerful companies, right? Very often, which are not dispassionate. I mean, because they're motivated by money. So in very big sums of money, let's not forget. And it's just I can't help inevitably but think through Foucault in this. And people again talk very simplistically about science, and as though science must have a capital S, right? It's science, without thinking, well, knowledge is always inflected through power. So how do we until we start to disentangle that power, how the power operates in a formation of knowledges, we can never speak of science with a capital S.
And yet it's, all over Berkeley where I am, people have signs on their lawn that say science is real. And this has been, of course, the whole debate about the coronavirus since the beginning has been, we must follow the science and not be, not be lured by the politics. And it's led all sorts of people to embrace this idea that, the science is just the science. And it is, the science is simply, some source of truth, as opposed to the sort of
dusted. It's very clear. We can obtain it. The scientists know what it is. And yet they disagree all the time, as the past year and a bit has shown us very clearly. Right?
And there's nothing about, like, the response to the coronavirus extends so far beyond the purview of any particular science. We're talking about the radical remaking of social relations, the radical sort of undoing of economies, of education forms. Is that all, under the rubric of science?
That's all science, yeah. Well, right. And this is exactly, it's, I remember, not to veer too much from your book, but I think it all relates somehow in very real ways. I remember Eric Schmidt, the former, I think he's now former CEO of Google. He was interviewed about 6 months into, so 6 months post March, I would imagine. So whatever month that would make that. And he basically said, look, whoever that we is, right? We have achieved 10 years worth of changes in 6 months. Now, and I can't help but ask and wonder, how does that benefit the majority of people? I very much doubt it does. And how does it benefit, however, a small group of people significantly, right? Because again, we notice, and this is not conspiracy theory, I'm not being conspiratorial, but again, power is very real. There's no getting away from the fact, the reality of power, and very subtle and sophisticated forms these days, right? So So not getting away from the fact that only a handful of people have literally raked in billions, if not trillions of dollars in the
Yeah.
past year, while millions and millions of people are on the verge of becoming homeless and without food, and it's insanity.
And it's
It's
been so politically effective, like that the in the United States, the liberal left has so embraced the idea that we must rule in accord with science, and it
mm,
sounds like it has very dangerous resonances, and
yes.
and um, and yet it's been so politically effective in sort of mobilizing a kind of political constituency, and for such as you're mentioning, like what is Google do what is the transformations that Google is effectively putting into place, let's say through these changes under the great lockdown, the great confinement,
Right,
have
right.
nothing to do with sort of some kind of scientific analysis of what promotes human flourishing or something. It's driven by all sorts of other imperatives that are none of which are particularly anything to celebrate. So I share your worry about this. I mean, you're making me, you mentioned poetry and it's earlier, and it makes me think, of course, I mean, when we study poetry in schools, of course, we do sort of, we recognize that poetry speaks to us, and whether we use the word truth or not, we recognize that it discloses something of value and importance to us in ways. But but there's a kind of, the very divisions of the disciplines, right, serves to kind of police in ways that identifies the sort of what is the appropriate scope for the unique kind of truth that poetry is capable of. Well, it's not understood to have, it shouldn't have implications in our lives beyond, let's say, the particular aesthetic realm of our personal pleasures and you know uh, private activities. And so in that sense, Andalusismo says, well, no, a kind of poetic grasp of history actually is the one that is necessary to reveal its truths in ways,
Mm,
and that the very sort of rejection of a poetic reflection on the past impoverishes our understanding of the past in ways. It doesn't just sort of like secure the objectivity of our versions of the past. It impoverishes it as well in certain ways at our detriment.
mm, mm.
So
Thank you so much. The as far as the as far as a poetic appreciation of one's past, could you say a little bit about the Alhambra as a monument to loss, as it has been read by certain people? And yeah, I keep tacking ideas on this, so I try
yeah,
to ask one question. So I'll just leave it at that, please.
yes, I mean the Alhambra, like there in Spain, there's a sort of long tradition of literary forms that the Alhambra and say medieval culture was portrayed in a particular way, and often that had to do with a kind of a society of the court with its gaiety and its nobilities and its intrigues and its as a place of sort of perpetual festivity. And
Right.
the Alhambra is sort of seen to be, and as Andalusismo develops in the 19th century, the Andalusistas are cultivating a different relation to it, and they say no, the Alhambra is not a monument to gaiety and festivity. It's a monument to immense pain and loss. It's a
Mm,
monument to the destruction of something that was great and that was sort of brutally effaced, and that and that and at great cost to us. And so they react to the earlier portrayals of the sort of Alhambra and the world that it anchored, by emphasizing a kind of attitude of melancholy towards the past as an attitude appropriate to kind of recognizing and sort of revivifying aspects of that past. And so there's all sorts of, I mean, I mentioned in the book Garcia Lorca, who is, the very famous Spanish poet who wrote quite a bit about many aspects of Granada, but including the Alhambra, and as a kind of as a place where of a certain sort of haunted by the kind of sad ghosts, and he understood that sort of attitude toward that attitude of recognizing the loss that the Alhambra marked for him was also an attitude that he saw that oriented toward people who suffered in a particular way, right? That made him, he understood that it opened up in him a kind of sensitivity to those who were marginalized and who suffered. And so that way of embracing the past, he saw, was also a way of cultivating a certain sort of feelingful relation to the downtrodden in the present, and which one finds in his poetry and writing. And so that's I think that in the sort of Spanish, the discourses of Spanish nationalism, of course, it's the effacement of that is the glorious moment of Spain coming to itself. And so the Andalusistas are writing against that kind of nationalist trend by invoking that palace as a place of sadness and as a place of mourning. And I think the Alhambra has stood and has played a particularly important role, let's say, in cultivating a kind of sensibility that's really been an essential aspect of Andalusismo. And I talk about in the book also flamenco as another site, like music is another very important site in which the certain sort of passions, and including sadness and melancholy and an attention to death, has been cultivated and recognized and elaborated. And so I think it's interesting to think about like melancholy as a kind of epistemic emotion that opens up that opens up the past, a particular face of the past, right? It's not a question of a distorted face, but it's a question of grasping, that this loss was immense and consequential and should be mourned, and that attitude towards the past is one that is enabling of us as contemporary Europeans, enabling of us both to sort of think about the challenges we face in our lives as Europeans, as Spaniards, as Andalusians, to sort of think politically, to think socially, and so it's not about, like, usually the sort of attitude of Andalusistas to the past is described through the language, well, we mentioned Romanticism, but also nostalgia and so on. And I think these terms, they are terms that, as I meant, describe a particular kind of European attitude toward the past that we recognize as important in the development of Europe, but not a kind of attitude that we see as contributing to this sort of our ethical and political reflection. It's rather, nostalgia and so on is a mode of, almost a kind of indulgent mode of certain escaping the ethical and political demands of the present for a kind of idealized past, and for the sort of false promise of recuperating that past. So those terms, it seems to me, and there are more nuanced versions of them, but they serve a kind of policing function in order to sort of say, well, this relation to the past is appropriate. These relations are fine as long as their significance is circumscribed to, the relevance that that those terms accorded. Nostalgia is fine as long as you recognize it's just nostalgia. Not that you recognize that, wait, that attitude toward the past makes claims on how we live. Like, that would be a dangerous that would be a dangerous kind of fall into nostalgia, and so that's why I've tried to avoid those sort of terms, and there are more, as I say, there are more nuanced uses of them, but I think that they tend to misguide us because they're so value laden that, once you call something even romantic or nostalgic, we can't help escape the idea that we already know what therefore its significance is. And I think my point in this book was that we don't know what the significance is. Even the Andalusistas don't quite know. It's an exploration. And they are trying to accommodate themselves to a world that they're just discovering in some ways because it's been effaced. And that's why I consider it more a space of possibility rather than one that we already know the outcome of that kind of activity.
Well, that's what makes it particularly interesting and rich. Could you mentioned flamenco and Andalusian music? Could you say a little bit more about their relationship, the type of shared language that they have, and also this notion that keeps cropping up that Arabs, Muslims, they were nothing more than simple carriers of a type of knowledge. So in the context of music, they basically carried these sort of Byzantine chants, and they without affecting the musical genre itself. Or I mean, I've even heard it mentioned by some very serious theologians, people I very much look up to, and they were pointing out for instance, no doubt, the very real influence that these Byzantine chants had on Quranic recitation. But of course, it's not that Muslim reciters of the Quran, they just maintained that and didn't bring their own flavor to it. So if you could maybe speak a little bit also to relatedly the idea that always crops up, that the Muslim sort of philosophers, or not, it's not even put in those terms in sort of in mainstream discussions, that Muslims were again simple carriers of this ancient philosophy, which such as ancient Greek philosophy and so forth, of which Europe, of course, was always its rightful heir. And so what is this attitude vis-a-vis the Muslim other? Is it a type of, again, forgive me, I'm going to end up making a bit of a long-winded question here, but it occurs to me as something of a narcissistic, egoic impulse, which almost cannot acknowledge outside of its own very brittle egoic self anything outside of itself that inevitably has gone into shaping itself. And we know through Buddhism, for example, that everything is interconnected in the most profoundest of ways. Nothing is independent of anything else. I'll leave it at that for now.
I think lots of these disciplines, let's say of musicology, of literary disciplines, and so on, right? Like historiography, they emerge in a moment in which, in one way or another, their task is to secure the identity, and one would almost say homogeneity and unity of the nation. And so there's a kind of, and particularly as regards to Spain, what securing, let's say, the identity of the Spanish literature, Spanish music, Spanish cultural forms, let's say, has primarily been entailed the expunging of the 800 years of Muslim and Jewish presence there. And so when you mention one of the ways that's done is this, to say, like, when features that seem to have come through, let's say, the Arab period in Iberia, and seem to have, let's say, even forms of architecture that were developed at that time, to sort of solve the problem of how can how can Spanish architectural forms be indebted in any way to Islam? The answer on one hand has been to say, well, actually, what Muslims brought were actually Byzantine Christian forms that they had appropriated. And so they were Christian all along, those forms. And they not, so therefore, those aspects, let's say, of Spanish architecture, which ostensibly seem to have a debt to Islam, it's actually a misreading that those features are more properly emerged first from Byzantium, and Islam was a kind of carrier that allowed them to. So, I mean, what I think one sees there is a kind of paranoia about around sort of identity and the homogeneity of one's identity, as if like that, if it were like, if one imagines like if you imagine, let's say, the world around the time in which, let's say, in the 8th century and 9th century, when Islam is Muslims are entering into southern Spain and into Spain in greater numbers, and one could either think about that as a certain sort of intrusion of a foreign element that remains always foreign and until it's finally expunged, or one can imagine, well, actually, there's a world in which there's all kinds of exchanges and appropriations and inflections between all sorts of different groups. It's a world that is not built on self-same stable identity forms, but a world in which identity formations are in a process of shifting and molding each other, in both through relations of antagonism and through relations of affinity and attraction, and so that kind of narrative makes the sort of the sort of spokespeople of the nation state nervous, because it precisely undoes the kind of deep history on which the nation state is supposed to be rooted as a kind of self-same identity that has deep roots. So on one hand, the idea that Islam simply served as a kind of carrier society was one solution to that, to say, well, actually, Islam actually contributed very little to developments in Europe, because it was really simply a vehicle through which earlier Greek or Christian elements were brought in, but Islam contributed very little itself. And I think that's I call it a paranoia, and I think it's a paranoia that's certainly the nation state has accentuated and intensified. And in this moment of a certain kind of anxiety in Europe and a political movement to define Europe in opposition once again to Islam, then that whole question about the sort of purity of Europe as a non-Muslim space, right, comes back in with a vengeance. And therefore, the kind of way in which white historians might be, and certainly historians have reflected, examined the ways in which practices from different societies have reciprocally, shaped each other in all sorts of borrowings. And you mentioned about Quranic chanting, right? I mean, can't one recognize that, yes, Quranic chanting was, emerged in a world in which there were all sorts of forms of chant and forms of both of musicality, of recitation, and that they didn't exist in some isolated bubbles. And it's so it's surprising how much that kind of nervousness and paranoia about securing the autonomy and self-same identity of certain cultural forms continues to be a question. I mean, in relation to flamenco, it's interesting, like the scholarship on flamenco, from a scholarly point of view, flamenco is largely described in terms of a kind of 19th century creation that produced in the context of Spanish nationalism, and therefore, a moment of a kind of the articulation of a tradition as part of a kind of modern politics of the nation, and so historians of flamenco are nervous, right, about making claims to any sort of deeper roots to that tradition, even though it's obvious in many ways, of course, that it has all kinds of roots in both in the Far East, both in South Asia and Romani traditions from South Asia, and as well as there's a certain sort of clear indebtedness to Arabic musical forms, and as well as it's like Jewish musical forms, and so to say that is to stray outside the bounds that the historiography of flamenco will allow. Then we're entering some speculative history that is, and for Andalusistas, it's a history that can be, one could say, one hears, and one cultivates an ability to hear that, and to hear the interminglings of musics and peoples and flamenco, and particularly flamenco, once one sort of explores its relation to musics of the Middle East, one hears all kinds of resonances. Resonances perhaps that are not quite, cannot be articulated in the languages of flamencology, right? But are capable of being heard by a sensitive ear, when attuned to, let's say, those relations, correspondences, similarities, overlaps, and so that's flamenco has been sort of the privileged medium through which a certain sort of both a kind of relation to the past can be sort of passionately recognized, and flamenco is a very passionate aesthetic form, but also the relations to the Middle East, and which can be heard in the sort of overlappings of musical forms. I mentioned in the book this guy Aziz Baloch, who is was like he was from Sindh and came in the, I want to say in the 30s, maybe in the 40s, to no, I think in the 30s, came to Spain, and when he heard flamenco, he said, "Oh my God, this is just the music of Sindh. What are we talking about? This sounds exactly like the music of Sindh." And so he learned, and he actually studied under the leading flamenco scholars of the time, and he wrote a book about this is Sindhi music. And the players of flamenco were impressed with his musical abilities, though they couldn't buy his history of flamenco as originating in Sindh. But it's another interesting.
Everyone, it seems, wants to claim the origin of everything. Right? We first originated this.
Yes.
Maybe it's just a human impulse, right?
Well, that too, of course. That's right. Well, we're talking
the question is who has the power to really enforce that idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was dismissed in at least that aspect of his argument.
Well, no, I think. Well, no, you raised some, sorry, I was just going to say, you raised some very, very important points that you make the distinction between musicologists and musicology's reading of things, which again, I can't help, having, for better and for worse, I'm sure, internalized so much of Foucault, I can't help but think, well, what are the sort of paradigms through which they're inevitably thinking, and what are the institutional biases, et cetera, in very sort of simplistic terms, perhaps. But versus, let's say, the musician's approach, as an amateur musician myself, and also musician's approach, as well as the avid listener, he or she ultimately, I would say, no serious musician or someone who really appreciates good music is really that concerned about where it came from, right? They want to hear, they want to experience it, they want to feel it, they want to feel through it, they want to experience it, and inevitably make connections as to, well, this reverberates in a certain manner. There's one band I'm sort of a little obsessed with. They would perhaps be described as art heavy metal. They're called Tool, a band called Tool, and they've been around since the 90s. And Well, so they are very heavily influenced by Eastern modalities. And it's a heavy metal band. They I mean, it's too much information about tour, but they hadn't released an album in, I think, 13 years because they had issues with their label, and finally fixed that issue. And it came out the first album like 13 years or 18 years, I forget. It sort of shot to number one, displacing Taylor, whatever the pop singers. Anyway, too much info about Taylor, not about Tour. But so as a musician, and it's interesting, for the longest time, even though I mean I have significant, I mean ethnically South Asian, so I mean I have significant background in South Asian musical forms, just in
Yeah.
terms of my listening experience. But it took me bizarrely a really long time to be like, oh my God, Tool just ripped off these South Asian, because they do something of their own ultimately. It's not so obviously all the time. Anyway, but you see my point. It's not a question of ripping off ultimately.
But I think your point about, from the musician's standpoint, it's what can be heard and made of those sounds in relation, and it's a kind of, the question is, what sort of musical space can I find for myself within the
Yes.
heterogeneities and overlaps here, and that is, um, that is also, in the book I try to think about that as a mode of as a kind of historical medium and as a kind of historical practice that is, and for the Andalusistas, that ability to sort of hear and move within this improvisatory space of possibility built by the overlap of these traditions, let's say, is kind of an essential aspect of encountering, those traditions and their rootedness in one's own sort of vocabularies, musical vocabularies, and including across the sea, but also in the past. And um,
So this I don't know if this relates exactly. I'm not sure if this is the right reference, but it makes me think about also Harold Bloom's, the famous literary critic theorist's notion of the anxiety of influence.
yeah,
That that the poet or the artist, I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, and I quickly just had to Google the name because I'd forgotten briefly, but it that the poet and the art or the artist is always cognizant, necessarily so, of his or her forebears, artistic creative forebears, and he or she, a good artist or poet or creator, is always trying to create something new, as it were. And this is in a sort of, I guess, in a modern Western context. In any case, so how one then relates to the past is in this kind of almost like an anxious mode. But nevertheless, there is always a relationality, whether conscious or unconsciously. And because the artist or creator, poet, what have you, no man is an island, as the saying goes, right? No one is sort of self-sufficient, self-contained in him or herself. And any serious musician, if they want to create serious music, they have to internalize so many years of music before they can really create something original. But somehow this sense, which is just kind of intuitive for me at least, and
mhm.
it stands to reason, and this is Harold Bloom's sort of argument as well. Somehow this is lost upon these sort of these scientific historians, which inevitably have a certain axe to grind, and we all have axes to grind. I think it's part of the human problem. But
Yes, I think that, I think that, one can recognize absolutely the value of the historical discipline and historical modes of inquiry, but one has also should recognize that that does not relegate other forms of, let's say, historical knowing and experience simply to, the dustbin of falsehoods,
mm,
even though they don't accord to with, let's say, the protocols and epistemologies of the discipline of history. It's wrong to think, therefore, that that's the only way of knowing. Like, that is like history monopolizes the only way of in which the real past, like what you were describing in terms of Bloom's take on sort of aesthetics of appropriation and transformation, right? It points to certain kinds of processes that have implication for our relation to the past.
Yes.
And even though they cannot be simply, they're not necessarily transparent, though, to a kind of historical purview. Um, and in part because history remains, the categories at its, there are ways in which it still has debt to its kind of 19th century formation and the sort of categories of uh, of language, of culture, of you know, of art, those categories that provided the sort of basis for kind of historical ways of knowing, right? Which presuppose certain kinds of, like, the distinctness of languages and cultures, and when when these things are kind of artificial, sort of, creations that are simply part of the kind of world of nation states, they play an important role, but they don't actually do justice to the sort of complicated ways in which the aspects of our life cannot be mapped onto those, those imperatives coming from our political forms. And I think that's, I think that's important to remember. Poetry is, poetic ways of knowing, I think, should be valorized as more than just simply the personal pleasures of our, you know,
Mm.
um, I mean, I always think when I talk to students, I say, well, if you imagine that, like Martin Luther King says that, I don't know, that it is love which binds us together, and you say, oh, well, that is, he just means that metaphorically or something, and I say, well, what if he doesn't mean it metaphorically?
Mm.
And I mean, metaphorically would presuppose, oh, that he really means that there's something else that's just a name for, like, I don't know, hormone G, or or saluting the flag. I don't know, but he doesn't mean that. No, he meant say he means actually in a literal sense. And so, how does one, is that a kind of falsehood, or is it? What is the challenge of grasping the reality of that claim, and one that cannot be made sense of within, let's say, the languages of our, our
Mm.
scientific or our, even our historical languages, and yet it needs to be in some way grasped in its literal sense if one is to understand what might have been meant by that.
You mentioned just now Martin Luther King within the sort of great African American liberation theological tradition. You mentioned also in your book W.B. Du Bois and his sort of understanding of his own history, his ancestors being slaves, and how he came to connect with that past through a type of could you say a little bit about that too? He felt
Yeah,
good. I'm not doing justice to how you described it.
yeah. I mean, it was interesting in that, when growing up, of course, he did not understand that he stood in any particular relation to Africa. Right? He had, the way in which he had gone to school and his early life had not oriented him to that dimension of his life, and so it was the one connection he had, and which to Africa, as he mentions, the one direct connection was a song that his grandmother used to sing. A grandmother who may have actually been to Africa, though he wasn't sure, and and um, and this song, he mentions that, a song sung in a language that was not available to him, and yet the song as this kind of, as this sort of one direct tie, he came to sort of, the song came to kind of, as he developed more experience, including the experience of race in the United States and racism, and the song in some ways infused those, right, as he understood it, it sort of colored those experiences, and in a way that, like, the emotions that were integral to that song and his relation to his grandmother and someone started shaping the way in which he now experienced a growing sense of affinity for Africa, a growing sense of attachment, and particularly as he encountered the way that race operated in the United States. But it was his, the way in which it was a kind of sensory attunement to the musical there and to all of the affective dimensions of that song that he saw as sort of, opening up the space in which he could increasingly come to grasp his life
mm,
as profoundly, mapped onto Africa. And indeed, and later on in life, Africa became immensely important to him, and he spent a lot of time there. And so it's that way in which it took a kind of a different sensory modality to open up a recognition of the way in which actually inhabited a space that was unrecognizable to him before.
mm,
It provided part of the effective impetus in which that connection could come to be a part of his life,
mm, mm.
and he could see himself then within, let's say, the history of the Caribbean slave trade and the history of African societies who have. So that struck me as very resonant with, that moment of kind of musical aesthetic affective reflection as important to sort of coming to be able to inhabit a space that was otherwise invisible to him, unrecognizable, right? And that's very much, I think, of like the way that flamenco has been, lived as a kind of, as something that enables one to attune to this heterogeneous inheritance of that striates one's life as an Andalusian. And there's something that, they resonated with me, those modes of kind of musical affective knowing.
No, this is amazing. Thanks. We'll slowly wrap up. I really appreciate so much your time. I just had a couple more quick thoughts and questions. One was to think sort of a little bit about, maybe slightly polemically, I'm not sure, but what is it about the European experience that insists on this radical othering of the other? And not that other cultures don't do it, but I can't help but think through, Christian theology, and I have a deep affinity for Christian theology, so it's not some sort of, I have a very profound affinity for Christian theology, but I'm really trying to understand what's going on, especially in Western Christianity has a very unique flavoring compared, of course, to Eastern Christianity. That I can't help but wonder, and this is not fully formed this thought, but it's like an intuition I had some years ago actually, that what is it about within a Christian worldview, the as it were, not only, but as it becomes interpreted, the trauma of Christ's crucifixion. I can't help, and this is again very sort of speculative and in its nascent form, I can't help but wonder if that, as it was interpreted as a trauma, because in the Eastern Orthodoxy, of course, there isn't this excessive focus on the crucifixion. It's in Christ's resurrection, of course. So that's really where the focus is. But in Western Christendom, there's this excessive focus on the trauma of the crucifixion. And I wonder what happens to a psyche, to a society, to a culture that does not process, as it were, such a momentous traumatic event, and ends up, again, very speculatively thinking through this, ends up sort of inflicting it on the rest of the world. And of course, initially, it's not only initially, but for a very long time, it's the Jews are the cause of this, forgetting that Christ himself was a Jew, of course. And it's only in very recent history that we now hear the phrase Judeo-Christian, right? Well, that's really hunky-dory after you massacred after you killed millions of Jews. Now it's like, oh, well, actually, we're Jewish Christian anyway. But I mean, not to get too polemical about this, but to get polemical about this. And so continue this train of thought, if you'll forgive me, the sort of theological, trying to understand the theological political, or how the political manifests through the theological. I can't help but wonder, again, I'm really not interested, genuinely, anyone who knows my sort of research interests, I try not to do that. But at least in terms of narratives, right, the Quranic narrative we find, right, from a Muslim point of view, God says that he created us in various tribes and nations so that we may come to know one another. And I remember hearing many, many years ago, the very interesting translator of the Quran, who's also translated, I believe, the Tao Te Ching and other Eastern works, Thomas Cleary. He said that verse, in his mind, was the great antidote to racism. That we must come to know one another, and to continue this, and I swear I'll finish very shortly. That the notion of convivencia or convivencia, which is problematized in the sort of context of Muslim Spain. Can you speak a little bit to that notion, and I'll stop with that.
Well, convivencia, which is a term that also Castro is very, Americo Castro is sort of, and the early and important proponent of that notion, of a notion that sort of, right, points to a kind of relationships of reciprocity and mutuality that bound in, both antagonistically but also positively Muslims, Jews, and Christians within kind of medieval Iberia. Um, his own sort of elaboration of that notion from the standpoint of modern historians and so on is seen to be, highly idealized. That it exaggerates the degree of commonality and hospitality, and because actually they were, the relations were actually bitter and violent, and so on. And I think I think there's something that claim that, actually, the relations were really, riven by violence, and um, not at all based in any kind of mutuality. It itself misses the point in some ways. Like, I think that for Andalusistas, one hears a range of views about, the way in which people understood those relations to have existed in medieval times. But the point is that it is seen that something, there were some modes of relationship that remain important to think about, because even if they were not idyllic, and even if they were actually, certainly involved forms of violence and forms of antagonism, and yet from the standpoint of today, they also enabled possibilities of cooperation um, and mutuality that seem difficult to imagine from the present, right? So one doesn't have to sort of subscribe to a highly idealized notion, and here you get into a very ideological, it seems to me, thing. Like, you either emphasize that in reality they were violent, or if you're not doing that, then you are creating a certain kind of ideological idealization of the past. And I think that misses the point. That past strikes us as important, and um, not because of its idealization, but because there were complicated relationships that enabled political forms in which, Muslims, Jews, and Christians could occupy, high positions within a shared governing structure, even if Muslims were ultimately dominant, and um, forms of relationship that deserve, attention, and that, particularly from the standpoint of the present, when those things seem, impossible. And one could say the same about, aspects of Ottoman society, right? In which,
Yes.
on one hand, you had certainly societies that had sharp demarcations. On the other hand, those demarcations didn't work the way they do now, and they opened up possibilities of both of sort of autonomy and of mutuality and interaction that, from the standpoint of today, seem rather improbable. And that's why that notion is important, I'd say. I mean, what you were saying about theology, I mean, you're right. Judeo-Christian is a very recent thing, and it is quite striking to hear it now invoked, and now it's become very standard that people invoke it, when people would have been in horror just like 50 years ago. How that there's something called Judeo-Christian society, and I mean, one of the texts that I think is interesting, thinking about like developments within Christianity. There's a historian, Thomas Masnak, who writes about medieval Christianity, and particularly about the sort of relations between Muslims and Christians, and he notes that it's a book called Crusading Peace, but he notes that in a context of long-standing antagonisms between Muslims and Christians in the up until the 12th century, when Christians killed Muslims in battle and so on, even it was understood that that may be on one hand necessary, but it was always polluting. That is, to kill another human being in that context, it, even if the church could recognize it as being necessary, it was inescapably polluting in some sense, right? And in the 12th century, there's a shift. And there's a new sort of edict that comes out that says, no, actually, it's not polluting at all. One can kill Muslims freely without there being any moral consequence. Mm. And those kind of shifts, right, which emerge in the early on in the crystallization of the oppositions, which eventually come to define, Europe as a non-Muslim entity and as opposed to Islam and so on. Those kind of theological, which it's a theological argument, right? It's a theological principle that is being developed there, right? Are key in sort of the kinds of antagonisms you're talking about, right? The solidification of violence at the core of that relation. And so that's I think that history we're not sort of, that history continues to be remade in surprising ways. And I mean, I'll just say in Spain today, the right-wing parties basically say, well, in the 15th century, Spain defended Europe and by expelling the dangerous Muslim other. And once again today, it is Spain's tasks on the border of Europe to ensure the purity and by keeping Muslims, by policing Muslims at the border and ensuring they don't get in. So there's a kind of re-invocation of reconquista now, like we must expel them and keep them out as a condition of sort of Europe's identity and its autonomous value system and Judeo-Christian value system and so on. So that history is not just overcome, it's recreated, and one sees it powerfully in the right-wing sort of xenophobic movements of Europe today.
And from a Jungian point of view, I think Jung's having something of resurgence in recent years, for better, less for worse. The sort of, in very simplistic terms, the shadow, if it's not sort of transmuted, and it's not exactly the language he uses, but it sort of manifests, it comes out in sort of dark and surprising ways, perhaps. So the other, which is the Muslim other, if we're always trying to live as though living by denying the reality of one's history and existence, then those elements are inevitably going to come out, and perhaps in scary and unpredictable ways. So I would just like to, with one final question, like to wrap up and ask you, what is the hope for us looking forward? Do you have hope? I know I'm not very hopeful. I mean, one always has to remain hopeful ultimately, but I'm also very fearful. I'm just globally where things are going, I'm very fearful. But anyway, again, I don't want to preempt any responses on your part.
Unfair to put that question on me as a last question. That's like, I feel like I must be, I'm compelled to say, oh yes, there is hope, but yet it's not exactly something that it's very hard to sort of speak of hope in this moment. I think not that I speak of hopelessness, but I mean, it seems we're living in a moment where certain transformations are rolling over us at a breakneck speed and in a direction that is very worrisome, and so it's I think it's I'm not sure that that we can do a lot, that hope is going to carry us forward in this way, that's something else we need besides hope. And
what do you think that thing might be? I mean, do you have an inkling?
I think hope asks you to sort of pull from the, let's say, from the present and from the rubble and the various elements of the present, pull out a kind of more an optimistic future from that. And I think we're not, that act of pulling out is beyond our reach in this moment. And what is, I mean, of course, one can always simply cling to hope in a kind of non-analytic way, right? As a certain sort of, as a kind of insistence on sustaining a sort of positive attitude, let's say, which I have nothing against that. But on the other hand, it seems to me that it would be to kind of try to extract from the various things taking place in the world something we want to hold up as a kind of icon of hope. I think that when we have to move more slowly and just stay with and attend closely to these and be on guard toward these shifting configurations that are taking place. And I think I think in this moment a sort of more cautious hope strikes me as a moment of almost maybe a danger or something, in so much as it extrapolates in perhaps more than we should be extrapolating from the present. And
interesting. I like that. Yeah.
I think that worries me, that hope might serve actually to like to sort of to distract our attention from actually things that are shifting in very unpredictable and difficult to decipher ways that don't accord with the vision that we've held up when we talk about our hope and so on. So I think that's all I can say on that.
No, that's amazing. Well, once again, it's just been such an incredibly enlightening experience learning from you.
Thank you.
Reading your book and having the incredible opportunity of speaking to you, and I'm sure many people will benefit from you. And thank you for all the work that you do. God bless you, and God bless the late Professor Mahmoud, and may you continue to share your wisdom and insights with us, and may we continue to learn from you.
Thank you, Hasan. It's really been a pleasure, and I really like the way that we touched on all sorts of things, from Tool to rap to all kinds of. I think that's
that's just an indication of how my ADD brain works. It's just going everywhere at all times. So it's a blessing and a curse. I've come to appreciate it as a more of a blessing these days. But
I think it's a blessing, and thanks for sharing it.
Oh, well, no, God bless you. Thank you so much. And I look forward to potential future conversations. I'd really love to genuinely also learn from you as far as your insights vis-a-vis this sort of contemporary technological moment that we're going through, this ever evolving, ever changing, shifting sort of landscape, which I think raises some very...
To that conversation.
Yes.
And for learning from you about that, because you've obviously, I think you've thought about it a lot yourself. So.
Oh, well, I tried to think a little bit about it, but no, thank you so much. God bless you again. And I look forward to talking to you soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Okay, Hasan, that was really a pleasure.